Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Statesmanship Project. In this episode, we're going to get back on track with our equation for program success. We're going to be talking about our next numerator variable. We discussed intensity last week. We're going to discuss frequency this week. Frequency, put basically, is the frequency at which you exercise. So in order to understand this conceptually, we have to quantify it. So how frequently are you exercising? Well, how frequently are you able to exercise? Theoretically, you could exercise 24/7, 365, but that's not going to be possible because you have to sleep, presumably 8 hours a day. So if we look at it over the course of a week, you have 168 hours in a week. If we're sleeping for 8 hours a day, that leaves us with 112 hours of awake time. And presumably you have to work for 40 hours a week, let's say hypothetically. So that leaves us with 72 hours, if my math is correct, of awake time. And so that's a lot of time that you could be exercising. But let's break it down more from there. Let's think about it as number of times in a day that you could exercise. So let's say you exercise 8 hours a day. Well, that would be something like every hour on the hour. So at the top of every hour, for 8 hours, you perform an exercise. Now, granted, the intensity and duration is very low, but you are training every hour on the hour for 8 hours. That's a pretty high frequency of training. The next level from that would probably be 2-a-days, where you train in the morning and then train in the evening. Arnold Schwarzenegger was allegedly famous for this, or this was the training that he allegedly used when he was at the peak of his bodybuilding career, when he would train for 2 hours in the morning and then come back later and train 2 hours at night. He did that 6 days in a row, training different body parts each time. And that's an incredibly high frequency of training. Now, a lot of people train daily. It would be 7 days a week. And then breaking down from there, you could train 6 days a week, 5 days a week, 4 days a week, 3 days a week, 2 days a week, 1 day a week. And then you could train once every 7 days, once every 8 days, once every 9 days, even once every 10 days. And then you would end up with an extremely low frequency of training. So these are the multiple different variations of frequency. And so we have to figure out, relative to our variables of intensity and duration, how frequently we can train, such that we are still getting adequate rest, allowing for adaptation, and not overtraining. We want to make sure that our intensity, if we're training with a high degree of frequency, our intensity and our duration cannot be extremely long unless we're enhanced, in which case it doesn't matter as much. But as a natural lifter, which is how we want to conceptualize ourselves and understand this program, we want to make sure that we are giving ourselves a reduced enough frequency that we are recovering from our training and keeping intensity and duration low, assuming that our frequency is high. Now, if our frequency is very low, we can increase our intensity and even increase our duration if we want to. But again, it's all about making sure it balances in our equation so that we get to 1. Another thing to consider about frequency is the frequency at which you are training a particular muscle group or movement pattern. This is the reason why bodybuilders split their training, because they want to increase or maintain a high frequency of training. So the number of times that they train is either every day or multiple times a day, but the exercises that they're doing, the muscle groups that they're training, the movement patterns that they're training are not as frequent. So if you look at someone like Mike Mentzer, his program would be, he would do chest and arms, like chest and biceps, and then 4 days later or 5 days later, depending on what his frequency was, he would do legs, and then 4 days later he would do back and triceps, and then 4 days after that he would do legs again. And so he was only training chest particularly once every 16 days. So this is a really low frequency for that particular muscle group, even though he was training every 4 days. And this is the program that he advises in his high intensity training program, especially for naturals. Now, most professional bodybuilders, well, all professional bodybuilders are on gear, but most of them, almost all of them, do high volume training, and their frequency is extremely high. So they're training they're training every day, multiple days a week, so like 5 days a week, something like that, 4 days a week, maybe 6 days a week, depending. Some of them do 2 a days, like Arnold Schwarzenegger did. But again, they're breaking the muscles of the body up into groups so that the frequency of training those particular muscle groups may only be once a week or twice a week, depending on how frequently they feel like they need to train those muscle groups. So that's something else to consider when considering frequency. We want to keep that in mind, the frequency at which we are training a particular muscle group, because frequency impacts both the muscles and the nervous system, as all training does. So when we train, we're training the nervous system, regardless of the muscles that we're training, especially the autonomic nervous system. It is always trained, it is always conditioned, it is always stimulated when we lift weights, regardless of the muscles that we're training or the movement patterns that we're training. And so that's important to keep in mind because that impacts our ability to recover and adapt. Even if we are only training a particular muscle group once a week or once a month, the stimulation of the nervous system happens every single time that we train, and that is an important factor to consider when evaluating frequency of training. Hope that this makes sense. I can elaborate on this more tomorrow after reviewing this and contemplating on it, seeing if there's anything else I think I need to add. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, have a good day.